Hello, everyone. I'm Melissa Reckner, and I'm the program manager at Penguin Court, which is a preserve of the Brandywine Conservancy. And I'm really happy to be with you today during this NatureWorks program to share some information about spring wildflowers. Before I get into that, I wanted to share a little information about Penguin Court because I realize many of you have probably not heard of it. Penguin Court is the former estate of the Richard Mellon Scaife family. It was Richard's parents, Alan Scaife and Sarah Mellon, who had Penguin Court constructed in the late 1930s as a second home to their primary residence in Pittsburgh. It's located about a mile south of the pie shop in Laughlintown. And when Mr. Scaife passed away, he gifted the land and a significant part of his art collection to the Brandywine Conservancy and Museum of Art. Penguin Court is operated as a private preserve, except for special activities and programs that we'll host on the grounds. Everything we do, registration is required for because space is limited, but anything that we host would be listed on Brandywine's website. So I encourage you to check that out. If you want to learn more about Penguin Court, there's a nice short 4.5-minute video about it that you can view on the website. Moving on to spring wildflowers, sometimes they're referred to as spring ephemerals. Ephemerals means short-lived. So a lot of our wildflowers do have a short period of time that they can grow their leaves, produce their flower, be pollinated, go to seed, and then die before the trees around them produce leaves and shade them out in the springtime. So not all spring wildflowers are ephemerals, and not everything I show you today is an ephemeral, but I just wanted you to be aware of that terminology. And before I highlight some specific plants, I wanted to encourage you, anytime you're out in nature, practice those leave no trace principles and take only pictures, not the actual flowers. With our spring wildflowers, they wilt very quickly. And if you pick one, you're taking the beauty and joy away from those following you from seeing what you just saw. And I know some people think, oh, it's just one plant. But if 100 people each pick one plant, you could effectively wipe out a community. Also, a lot of our wildflowers are slow growers. This one in the upper left-hand corner, that's a red trillium. Trilliums take 7 to 9 years to go from seed to flower. So that's a pretty long time in plant world. Also, perhaps most importantly, a lot of these spring wildflowers serve as early nectar sources and host plants for a variety of insects and pollinators. Finally, maybe a little selfishly, a lot of these plants can be poisonous or their sap can be an irritant to your skin. So again, we encourage you, don't pick the flower, leave it there and just enjoy its beauty. So I'm going to highlight a few species that you might see in the Laurel Highlands this spring. Bloodroot, the one shown here, is one of the first to emerge, so you might see it as early as March. It's an interesting plant because when it comes out of the ground, its blossoms are protected by the leaves that kind of clasp around it. It might have 8 to 16 of these white petals that close at night and in cloudy weather, very much like a tulip, because it's protecting that precious pollen inside of it. The petals are really fragile. A heavy rain or a strong wind could knock them off. And it's appropriately named bloodroot or Sanguinaria canadensis. Sanguis is Latin for blood, because if you bust it open, the sap is this brilliant red color. Of course, we don't encourage you to do that. It is a poisonous plant and a member of the poppy family. It's also interesting because when it's flowering, it's only about 6 inches high. And then once it goes to seed, the leaf will continue growing and could be a foot off the ground. Yellow trout lily is one of my favorites. You typically find these in wet areas, so look along the floodplains. They are long-lived colonies, so when you see one, you'll see a lot. And they're so named because if you look at the leaves, you'll see that they're kind of splotchy with that purpley brown coloration. And whoever named it thought it looked very much like the back of a brook trout, which is pictured here. That modeling pattern is very similar. So that's how it got its name. When it flowers, you'll see this real pretty yellow lily-like flower coming out of a pair of leaves. If there's just one leaf, it's not old enough to produce a flower. The flower will kind of bob down or nod. And I recently learned nodding flowers are attractive, especially to ground bees. And if you look very carefully, you'll see, especially in the upper photograph, that the leaves kind of, or I'm sorry, the petals kind of curve backwards. That's called retroflex. And it's just another way to distinguish yellow trout lily. Sometimes there are white trout lilies, but those are pretty rare. Next up is one of my favorites. It's called fringed polygala. Now it looks like an orchid, but it's actually a member of the milkwort family. Supposedly milkworts help increase milk production in nursing mammals. So poly means many and gala means milk. So again, appropriately named. White is very rare. More commonly, you'll see this beautiful magenta color, but these are teeny tiny wildflowers. They don't grow any higher than 5 inches. Sometimes they're called day wings or bird on the wings because you see these purple petal-like structures. Those are actually the plant's sepals, which protect the petals. And they have 5 sepals. 3 of them kind of form a tube along with 2 of the petals. And then the other 2 fly away, very much like a bird on the fly. So again, some of those common names are quite appropriate and fun to think of. But the petals, like I said, will fuse into a tube, with the last one being the one on the end with the frillies that attracts the pollinators. Now, I have not seen this in very many places. You really do have to have a sharp eye for it. And it's listed as endangered in Ohio. So I have a feeling there's just not a strong population of them in Pennsylvania. A more common spring wildflower are our May apples. I'm sure many of you have seen the umbrella-like structures in the forest underneath some of our mature trees, growing usually in some pretty wide colonies because they do spread via rhizomes much more readily than they do via seed. They can grow 12 to 18 inches tall, and you'll see in the springtime, the older plants will develop this white blossom that looks very much like an apple blossom. And once it's pollinated, it'll produce a fruit that is initially brown, or I'm sorry, green in color, and then it'll ripen to a yellow, and then sometimes it'll turn brown if you find one that's really old, but that I think is pretty uncommon because a lot of wildlife really love to eat the fruit. Now it's important to know the other parts of the plant are poisonous, but if you can find the yellow fruit, you can eat it or make jams and jellies out of it. But honestly, the wildlife usually beat you to it. What's interesting about May apples, they take 4 to 5 years to mature. And if you find a single stemmed plant, it's not old enough to produce a flower and has to have at least 2 leaves on it in order to blossom. Foam flower is another beauty that you find most often in wet areas. It'll grow in these big clumps and has really interesting leaves that are rather deeply veined, and the veining is usually darker than the lighter leaf itself. They shoot up these spiky white blossoms that will, of course, fade away, but the leaves will persist through winter. This makes a really excellent ground cover, and it is deer and rabbit resistant. And I couldn't talk about spring wildflowers without highlighting trilliums. I think these are the quintessential spring wildflower, especially in Pennsylvania. They're appropriately named because if you notice in this top photograph, shows it really well, each plant will have 3 sepals, which are these green-like structures. It'll have 3 petals, which in this top photo are the red. And then it'll also have 3 leaves, which you can see more easily in the bottom left corner. Now, the United States Department of Agriculture says that there are 43 species of trilliums worldwide, with 38 in North America. Now, some are specific to California or Florida, but their plants database says that there are 9 native to Pennsylvania. I have 4 of them listed here. This lower right one, the white, this particular plant is getting a little old, so its petals are becoming a little translucent, but I think they are just gorgeous to see the white trilliums on a forest floor. It's such a wonderful burst of color. The one in the top is sometimes called red or purple trillium. Where I grew up, these were pretty popular and the woods are more common. Interestingly, they are sometimes referred to as stinking Benjamin or Indian shamrock. Some wildflowers do not give off a very pleasant odor because that's important for attracting beetles and flies for pollination. Then this one in the lower left is called painted or wake robin trillium, although I've heard the red referred to as wake robin as well, which is why it's always important to list or talk of the scientific name because lots of people have different names for the same wildflower. The painted trillium has white petals with a little pink center, and they really are quite gorgeous, but I think they're much more rare. And then I know somewhere I had a picture of nodding or whippoorwill trillium, but I just couldn't find it. And in addition, there are some other ones known as Little Sweet Betsy, nodding wake robin, snow trillium, which I've heard grows along the Laurel Highlands Trail, but I have not personally seen it. There's one referred to as Bloody Butcher, and then toadshade. And I think a lot of people would be familiar with toadshade, especially in cultivated gardens. I've not personally seen this growing in the wild, but certainly in recreated native gardens. And finally, I wanted to conclude by sharing a little information about garlic mustard. Garlic mustard is an invasive plant, meaning it's not native to Pennsylvania or even the United States. It was introduced from Europe. It's a member of the mustard family, and it's allelopathic, meaning its roots give off a chemical that inhibits the growth of any other kind of plant except for more garlic mustard. So it chokes out a lot of the native plants that our wildlife need to grow and live. Some humans might eat garlic mustard. If you break the leaves or the roots, it does smell like garlic. And I know some people who might make a pesto, for example, out of it, but animals and insects won't eat it. And in fact, there's a butterfly known as the West Virginia white that mistakes it as a toothwort, which is its host plant, but instead the butterfly will sometimes lay its eggs on garlic mustard, and when the eggs hatch and the caterpillars emerge and begin munching, they can't ingest the garlic mustard and they die. It's really easy to identify, I think, because like I said, when you crush the leaves, it is fragrant like garlic. It's a biennial, meaning in the first year of growth, it just has short rounded leaves, very low to the ground. And then in year 2 is whenever it sends up this tall spike with the white petaled flowers on the very tips. I encourage you anytime you see this to pull it out. It's very easy to pull out because it's not very deeply rooted, but pull it before it goes to seed because it will produce tens of thousands of seeds. And I've read that the seeds can remain viable in the soil for up to 10 years. So it might seem like a never-ending battle, but at least it's kind of an easier battle because, like I said, it's just one that you can easily pull out by hand. So I hope you appreciated today's presentation. I know it's super short because there's a lot more wildflowers that live in Pennsylvania's woods, but this was just kind of a teaser to get you out there looking for these spring wildflowers. Maybe download a couple identification apps to your phone or get a field guide and go out and look for them. And through Brandywine, I'll probably offer another spring wildflower presentation. So check out Brandywine's website for when that will be.